I want you to pause for a moment, not because this is another Donald Trump outburst, but because what happened this week quietly crossed a line most Americans assume can never be crossed. A sitting president responded to routine budget questions from his own party, not with answers, not with negotiation, but with threats. Threats that triggered death threats against members of Congress, threats that forced Capitol Police to increase security for elected officials doing their constitutional jobs. This isn't about temperament. It isn't about personality. And it certainly isn't just another social media meltdown. This is about whether Congress can still function as a co-equal branch of government when oversight is treated as betrayal. It's about what happens when loyalty replaces law. And it's about how democracies don't collapse all at once. They fracture under pressure, quietly, legally, step by step. Stay with me. Because once you see the pattern behind this moment, you'll realize why even Trump's own allies are now saying something has fundamentally broken and why the consequences won't stop here. Let's strip away the noise and look at what actually happened. This did not begin as a crisis. It began as a routine act of governance. A budget hearing? Republican lawmakers asking basic questions about spending cuts, district impacts, numbers that didn't add up. This is how Congress is supposed to work. Oversight is not rebellion. Questioning is not betrayal. And presidents are not kings. But in this moment, something revealed itself. Because the reaction wasn't debate. It wasn't clarification. It was retaliation. Within minutes, oversight was redefined as disloyalty. Legislators became traitors. Questions became attacks. And a constitutional process was treated like a personal insult. That shift matters more than any single post. Because when a president cannot tolerate questions from his own party, the problem is no longer political. It's structural. And once that boundary breaks, the system doesn't fail loudly. It starts bending quietly until it no longer snaps back. Now, to understand why this reaction was so explosive, we need to go backward. Because this moment didn't come out of nowhere. To understand why this exploded the way it did, you have to understand the history beneath it. In every functioning democracy, tension between the executive and the legislature is not a flaw. It's a feature. Oversight exists precisely because power concentrates naturally, and without resistance, it corrodes. But over the past decade, that balance has been quietly rewritten. Not through laws, not through amendments. Through loyalty. Trump did not invent this dynamic, but he perfected it. Political support was no longer transactional or ideological. It became personal, absolute, conditional on obedience. Gradually, a dangerous equation formed. Support Trump completely, and you're protected. Question him, even mildly, and you're marked. This isn't unprecedented in history. We've seen it in fragile democracies before. Leaders who survive not by institutions, but by devotion, where the test of legitimacy is not the Constitution, but allegiance. So when Republicans asked budget questions, Trump didn't hear oversight. He heard defiance. And in a system built on loyalty, defiance must be punished. That's why what came next was inevitable. And then the moment arrived. A single question asked by a Republican, not an opponent, not a critic, but a longtime ally doing routine oversight in a budget hearing. Tom Cole didn't accuse, he didn't challenge Trump's authority. He asked how proposed cuts to agricultural subsidies would affect rural communities. That was it. But Trump was watching, and in his mind, something snapped. Within 30 minutes, the response began. One post, then another. By the end of the day, there were 17. What started as political criticism escalated into something far more dangerous. Cole was labeled a traitor, a rhino, someone who should be removed from Congress. Then the language darkened. Trump didn't just attack motives. He questioned loyalty to the nation itself. He suggested consequences. He implied action. This wasn't strategy. It was instinct. And here's the critical point. When a president treats oversight as treason, every future act of governance becomes a potential crisis. Because this wasn't about Tom Cole. It was a warning shot, and everyone on Capitol Hill heard it. What you're seeing here is not chaos. It's a system. Trump's power doesn't operate through policy detail or legislative mastery. It operates through signaling, language as a weapon. Attention is enforcement. When he uses words like traitor, he isn't persuading, he's designating a target. This is how the mechanism works. First, he publicly names someone, then he frames them as an enemy of real Americans. Then he suggests action without specifying it. He never has to give an order. The system completes the sentence for him because his followers have learned the pattern. They've seen what happens after fight, after march, after they need to be dealt with. And crucially, this mechanism thrives on ambiguity. It allows Trump to deny responsibility while the consequences unfold exactly as expected. Threats arrive, phone lines flood, security increases, the intimidation is real. The accountability is not, this is why the danger isn't a single post or a bad night online. It's that the system rewards escalation. Every time it works, it becomes easier to use again. And once intimidation becomes effective, it replaces debate. That's when democratic processes begin to hollow out from the inside. And the next escalation was already in motion. The consequences came fast. Within hours of Trump's posts, congressional offices began reporting threats. Not vague anger, not heated rhetoric. Death threats. Staffers answered phones to hear voices saying lawmakers should be hanged. Shot, that they should watch their backs. Capitol Police had no choice. Security was increased for multiple Republican members, not because they opposed the president, but because they asked questions. This is the moment where politics ends and governance collapses, because fear changes behavior. And everyone in Washington understands that. Republican leaders were suddenly trapped. Defend their members and confront Trump, risking their own political survival. Or stay silent and accept that intimidation is now part of the system. There was no safe option, only damage control. Behind closed doors, lawmakers began recalculating not policy positions, not strategy, risk. Is it worth asking questions? Is it worth holding hearings? Is it worth putting your family in danger? That's how intimidation works. It doesn't need to silence everyone. It just needs to silence enough. And once that calculation enters the system, democracy doesn't break loudly. It retreats quietly. Now I want to speak directly to you, because this isn't just happening inside committee rooms or behind Capitol doors. It reaches into ordinary lives faster than most people realize. When lawmakers hesitate to ask questions, you pay the price. When oversight disappears, mistakes go unchecked. When fear replaces debate, bad decisions multiply. You don't see it immediately. It shows up later in budgets that don't make sense, in programs cut without explanation, in policies rushed through without scrutiny. And here's the part most people miss. Intimidation doesn't just silence politicians. It teaches everyone else to stay quiet, too. Staffers stop raising concerns. Experts stop offering warnings. Civil servants learn that honesty carries risk. That's how systems decay. Not because people stop caring, but because speaking up becomes dangerous. So when you hear about death threats against lawmakers, this isn't someone else's problem. It's a warning sign, a signal that the machinery designed to protect you is starting to malfunction. If you believe questions should never be punished, if you believe democracy depends on scrutiny, then this moment matters. And what makes it even more dangerous is that this pressure doesn't stop at America's borders. What happens in Washington never stays in Washington. When a U.S. president threatens his own legislature, the signal travels instantly. Allies notice. Adversaries take notes. Around the world, governments measure American strength not just by military power, but by institutional restraint, by whether rules still bind leaders, by whether checks still function under pressure. When those checks weaken, credibility erodes. Authoritarian leaders don't need to copy Trump's words. They copy the outcome. They see that intimidation works. That ambiguity protects the instigator. That loyalty can overpower law. This is how norms spread. Quietly, legally, one precedent at a time. Allies grow uncertain. If Congress can't constrain the president at home, can treaties be trusted abroad? Can commitments survive personal loyalty tests? Adversaries become bolder. They test boundaries. They push pressure points. And inside fragile democracies, this moment becomes a template. If America tolerates intimidation of lawmakers, why shouldn't they? That's why this episode matters far beyond party politics. It's not about left versus right. It's about whether constitutional governance still sets the standard or whether power without restraint becomes the new normal. And that brings us to the hardest question of all. What happens next? From here, the system faces three possible paths. The first is the best-case scenario. Republican leaders draw a line. They defend congressional oversight openly. Trump's intimidation fails to silence questioning, and institutions reassert themselves. This path is difficult. It requires political courage. It risks careers, but it restores a basic rule. No president is above scrutiny. The second path is the most likely: silence. Oversight continues on paper, but not in practice. Hearings become performative. Questions soften. Dangerous topics are avoided. The system still functions technically, but its core purpose is hollowed out. Democracy doesn't collapse. It degrades. The third path is the darkest. Intimidation becomes normalized. Threats are no longer shocking. Lawmakers adapt by submitting. In this scenario, loyalty becomes the governing principle. Oversight is treated as sabotage. And the separation of powers exists only in textbooks. History tells us something uncomfortable. Systems rarely choose the best path by default. They drift toward the path of least resistance. That's why moments like this matter, because the direction is set not by words, but by responses. And that brings us to the final question. What does accountability look like now? This moment will be remembered not for what Trump posted, but for what followed. Because the real test of a democracy is not whether a leader lashes out. It's whether the system responds. When a president threatens lawmakers for asking questions, the issue is no longer partisan. It's constitutional. It's about whether power is constrained by law or protected by fear. History is clear on this point. Democratic systems don't usually collapse through coups. They erode when intimidation goes unanswered. When norms are violated repeatedly without consequence. When silence becomes safer than accountability. That's the choice now confronting Congress. Not Democrats versus Republicans, but law versus loyalty. If threats against legislators become just another political tactic, oversight becomes optional. And when oversight becomes optional, democracy becomes conditional. So pay attention to what happens next. Not the outrage cycles, not the headlines. Watch who speaks. Watch who stays silent. Watch whether questions continue to be asked or quietly disappear. Because the survival of democratic governance doesn't depend on one man. It depends on whether institutions still have the courage to restrain him. If this analysis helped you see the system behind the spectacle, stay with this conversation. Share it. And keep asking the questions power fears most, because once questions stop, democracy doesn't get a warning. It just fades.